A little to the west of Canterbury, as you leave the eastern side of Kent and head towards London on the A2, and as the ground rises and is wooded, there are two important late Iron Age enclosure sites which we could bracket into the category of hill forts, and they seem very potentially to have a connection with the Caesarian invasions in the 50s BC. They're certainly part of the story of the development of Canterbury from the late Iron Age, when it was an oppidum site, into a town in the Roman period, and then subsequently into the town that we know these days, the town and city with its grand cathedral. Now, one of these Iron Age sites is on the south side of the A2 at Bigbree. That site is comparatively well known, but another site came to light, perhaps its partner, to the north of the A2 by a LiDAR survey about 10 years ago. And we'll look at both of these sites and then the wider picture of the Iron Age in Canterbury as it moves through into the late period and the dawn of the Roman visits and then conquest to Britain. So these sites are not particularly well known because they are somewhat inaccessible. They're inaccessible because they're sort of in the way of pathways to them. There's little signposting, there's nothing in the way of car parks. So they've sort of kept their secrets. They're like Canterbury's best kept heritage archaeology secret. However, the site at Bigbree was investigated in the 1930s with trial trenches organised and then written up and published by Jessup and Cook, and some of the images I'm showing you today are from their publication. And then subsequently, about 40 years ago, at the end of the 70s and into the early 1980s, they were looked at again by Hugh Thompson, and again that work was published in 1983, and the images are coming from those two publications. So you can see here an outline of the enclosure works, the earthworks, the defences, the ramparts and ditches at Bigbree, with an annex on its London side, if you like, and a couple of entrances. It's a flat-topped hill at the end of a spur of land that really goes all the way down to the centre of Kent, down the side of the Stour Valley towards Ashford. And so it's kind of like a natural pathway from the centre of Kent towards the area of Canterbury and northeast Kent. And so it is today that it follows, it's followed by paths and trackways and roads, and in medieval times was known as the Pilgrim's Way. Now at Bigbree, excavations in the 1930s and as we saw at the end of the 1970s, will cut across these earthwork defences, these ramparts and ditches, and they're the black lines here, boxes and rectangles. And the ramparts and defences are pretty well preserved in various locations, and I've circled some of those there. We'll be looking at those a little later on. An important find was a hoard, a set of Iron Age ironwork, which was discovered during gravel extractions in the 19th century and collected up. The context of its find spot was not recorded at the time, but it's a very important, significant collection, as we'll see. Like many archaeological sites, it's had a history. It's been battered about a bit through the ages, and gravel quarrying in the 19th century was just one episode of that work. Now, where does Caesar fit in? Well, if we look at Caesar's account of his visits to Britain, in particular Book 5, and we're looking at the year 54 BC, he lands in East Kent. We don't exactly know where, and he tells us that he marches on a night march 12 miles from the coast inland to a site where there is then a battle the following day. And the topography, the distance, the details that he provides for us fit in with a context at Bigbree, and this is a map from Thompson's publication. Caesar tells us that there are prepared positions held by the ancient Britons. They have cavalry, they have chariots, there's a river in front of these prepared defences, and the ancient Britons, the Iron Age people of Kent, are ready for war. And then battle ensues, the Romans are victorious. So the topography, the distance, the description fits in with Bigbree, or perhaps Holmesdale, or both of them, being the sites that Caesar tells us about. And if we look at the main commentators, the main authorities for the Roman period, the Iron Age in Kent, the Iron Age and Roman periods in Britain, there's a general consensus that Bigbree is the site of this battle. And it would be an important place to try and hold if you're the ancient Britons, because it is the sort of natural thoroughfare through, as is followed by the A2, from East Kent to London. So it's an important arterial route. Of course, London in the Iron Age didn't exist, but it's the crossing of the Thames that is important at the sort of lowest bridging point, as it would be, and into the heartland of England. So it's a sort of natural corridor into the heart of England. So where did Caesar land? Well, Andrew Fitzpatrick has been searching for that landing spot, and he did some excavations a few years back at Pegwell Bay, and found an important late Iron Age site there. Whether this is the landing point of Caesar is much disputed still, but you can see why Bigbree, which is 10 on the map here, would be really significant for a blocking, if you like, of Caesar's invasion of Britain. So let's just have a look at some of the details then of Bigbree. And we'll look at these defences here on the northeastern side. Now, in 1965 there was an excavation there which found a slingshot pellet, sort of thing, exactly ammunition that you would find on a defended enclosure of this period. So if we walk up by the roadside today and approach the earthworks, what do we see? We see a rise in the land, and then we see a chicane entrance followed by the modern road as it cuts through the earthwork defences. And here we are looking back down the road towards Canterbury. You can see one of the main banks here, and of course it's eroded. In the Iron Age time, of course, there would have been a defensive wooden tower here, a massive gateway, and a potential killing zone in front of it. And the ramparts would have had perhaps defenders on them, and they would certainly have had a wooden facade along them, a palisade, a bit like a stockade or a Wild West fort that we see in Western films. So it would have been a stronghold. And you can see that the modern road cuts round through, following a ditch line, I think, here between two earth ramparts, and you can see they're very, very substantive even today. So this is an inner one, this is the one on the outside that we'll be looking at, and then beyond that there's a third one. So really these are significant earthworks and defences. And that's what you would have seen if you were a Roman in 54 BC, looking towards the spur at which Bigbree sits. And then if you're ancient Britain looking at the Romans are on the march, and you're about to be defeated here in the gateway to Iron Age Britain. Now, one of the intriguing things about Bigbree is that we don't have any footprint of Caesar there. We don't have any footprint for a battle. But then battlefield archaeology is notoriously difficult to detect. What the site does have, though, is some extraordinary metalwork, as I mentioned earlier, a hoard of metal, very sort of charged material, symbolically, culturally charged material, including these slave shackles here and padlock being 48. And presumably these are ancient Britons who are being shipped out of Britain, sold to traders, and they will end up in the core of the Roman world with this insatiable appetite for slaves that the Roman Empire, or the late Roman Republic, Roman Empire, needed and indulged itself with. And indeed Strabo, the ancient historian geographer, tells us that that is one of the main exports from Iron Age Britain, slaves. So it's very, very sobering to find something like this on the doorstep, I suppose, of the empire as it was going to become. But also culturally charged items were found in this iron hoard as well. These suspension hangers for cauldrons, so items to do with feasting. People coming together, power exchanges between people over dining, and all the social exchange that you would expect around a big feast. Also productive items as well, these important transformative tools made out of iron. These have been the leading technology of the time, of course. And going back to the feasts there, this cute little figure here that looks a bit like a dog or a deer, that is what we call really a sort of fire guard, a fire dog for this period. And we see them in high status burials either side of the channel at this time, often associated with a cauldron, as you can see in the background there, and other paraphernalia for fine dining, including amphorae. And indeed Bigbree has produced a handle from a Dressel 1 amphora, which will be dating to the time of Caesar. Now these items were imported in small quantities into late Iron Age Britain, and they would have held wine from the core of Italy. And we know that because they have volcanic sand in the clay that makes the fabric of these amphorae. So they've come from central Italy, and they date to the 1st century BC, the time of Caesar, and so we can see that Bigbree was occupied at this time for certain. So that's quite an important find. So we found the handle there, and it's come from a type like this, 100 years before the invasion of Claudius, of course. Now, one of the projects that we've been involved with at the University of Kent is to team up with the Kent Wildlife Trust and Canterbury Archaeological Trust to investigate Bigbree and the surrounds. And this is part of that survey. There's a LiDAR evidence that we were looking at and interpreting from around about 10 years ago in that partnership for investigation. And LiDAR allows you to see below the trees the topography there and how it's been altered. So you can see very clearly the enclosure at Bigbree, the earthworks there, where the gravel quarries are, where the Hoard site was. And also if you look closer you'll see other features as well. And it gives us the idea actually that Bigbree is part of a much bigger complex, a much broader complex. It's perhaps one citadel, if you like, of a whole developed landscape in the late Iron Age, a landscape of power and authority, and pretty technologically advanced as well. Now, one of the developments of that project was the receipt of funding for a bursary for a PhD study from Paul Dyer, kindly gifted by Paul Dyer, and Andy Bates undertook that PhD study, which was finished a couple of years back, and here's Andy with one of his finds of late Iron Age pottery from Bigbree, material just falling out the gravel quarry sides of the site there. Now this image here is to do with a manipulation of that LiDAR data, and it shows a ramp here, what could be a ramp, and Caesar tells us that his 7th Legion builds a ramp of earth to enter successfully and the enclosure at Bigbree and defeat the ancient Britons. So we could be looking at Caesar's ramp here on the eastern side of the earthworks. What Andy also discovered through his own geophysics and then trial trenching was that there's a much earlier story to Bigbree as well. The occupation in and around that site dates back into the Bronze Age and to the early Iron Age as well, so it has a much longer history than anyone had previously realised. Now I mentioned that other site north of the A2 at Holmestall Wood, so we're looking from the interior of Bigbree now, we're looking north towards Holmestall Wood up there. And again, LiDAR revealed something that hadn't really been appreciated at all widely, that there's a large enclosure there. Again, following the sort of contour and topography, they're enclosing a flat-topped area with earthworks, which you can see there on this LiDAR survey. And this work was particularly carried forward by Christopher Sparry Green, investigating these earthworks here. And you can see water sitting in the outer ditch here, and then you see the rise of a rampart through here. And again, the walkway along here follows the top of the rampart, and where the water lies down there, that's the filled-in ditch. Now, some speculation that this could be one of Caesar's sort of camps, if you like, a defensive enclosure which houses legions whilst he was invading Britain, where he was posturing across at Bigbree. Now, we don't know for certain if that's the case. It's possible. Christopher undertook excavations here over several seasons. Here we see the work undertaken about 5 years ago, and there's Christopher with his map interpreting the LiDAR survey. And you see the section across the earthworks here where there's been tree fall, justifying the investigations. They had permission to do that. And so really the search is on to find the footprint of Caesar. Christopher is a research fellow, an honorary research fellow of the department here at Kent. One of his finds actually was a collection of sherds, again from a Dressel 1 wine amphory, dating to the 1st century BC. So a pair, if you like, to the one we saw over in Bigbree. Presumably there's many, many more sherds of these amphorae there, so it's dating the site, an activity at that site to this period. Whether Caesar's army was there, we still don't know. This is a map produced really on the data that was collected from the LiDAR survey and from Christopher's observations. And what I'm going to talk about now is work that was done last summer by our students at the university in this area as you approach perhaps the main entrance to the enclosure at Holmesdale. And this was test pit evaluation and the sort of outer hornworks there, which was just possible really as we opened up last summer for activities as COVID was suppressed. So this was obviously all undertaken within COVID safety guidelines. And here you can see the test pits being dug by some of our students. That was all recorded. And some of the interesting finds included sherds of, again, late Iron Age pottery, grog-tempered pottery, dating either side of the turn of the first millennium, so at the end of the BC into AD. Just to be standard pottery around courseware pottery of the late Iron Age. So it'd be important to go back there and continue this type of work. Now, other work that was undertaken last summer for student training and for research purposes was up on the north side of the campus here at Canterbury, and here you can see some of our students at work with the trial trenches that were dug in September there. Again, in excavation and finds bubbles, you can see 3 of the teams there. Now, this followed on from geophysical survey undertaken by our previous undergraduate student Fred Birkbeck of this area, and showed the potential there for archaeological features and discoveries in the area of the Blean Church on the plateau overlooking the campus. So you can see various features there highlighted by the geophysics. The 3 trenches were opened up and survey work was undertaken. The excavations that I've got the slide up for here show a section from which, again, late Iron Age pottery was discovered in a couple of contexts here in this ditch section. So again, testimony to Iron Age occupation in and around Canterbury on the highland overlooking the Stour Valley. So perhaps a precursor to the development of Canterbury at the very, very end of the Iron Age as we move into the Roman period. So there were very interesting finds, lots of potential there for follow-up work, for training for students in the recovery and recording of evidence, all types of evidence there. So this is part of a broader project you might see coming together, looking at Iron Age sites around the Stour Valley, and that work goes forward and will be an important initiative for us to pursue, particularly this coming summer when we're looking at a site at Swaring, again as a student training excavation project, following on from the work undertaken by Tom Marshall, our third-year student who surveyed the area. So we look forward to that work this coming summer. Thank you.